Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hi Layne.
Hi, hello everyone.
So today we're continuing our discussion on cool flowers, which are cool season hardy annuals. And Layne has lined up some come and cut again, I believe. So, friends, if this is your first time here, before we dive into our subject matter, we just want to welcome you and thank you for dropping in. And this podcast is brought to you by the Gardener's Workshop.com. And if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing over there, check out our website. Layne is our seed manager over there. I'm the head bottle washer, you might say, over there. And we have a great platform full of educational information, all of our seeds, our tools, supplies, and books. And we invite you to join us over there. And of course, we love it when you subscribe. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, you need to know that Layne makes a beautiful slideshow to go along with this chat. So you can always drop in over there and actually see what's going on, not just hear. So take it away, Layne.
All right, so this is going to be a follow-up to our episode number 21, which was part 1 of our Cut and Come Again Cool Flowers. So we covered 11 flowers in that episode, and believe it or not, we still have 14 more cool flowers to cover. So in today's episode, which is part 2, we're going to cover 7, and then next week we will release part 3, which will be the final 7 to round out our list of Cut and Come Again cool flowers. So
Awesome.
Are you ready to get started?
I am. Lay them on me.
Okay. All right. So we already covered this in our part 1 episode, but just briefly, Lisa, remind everyone, what are we referring to as a cut and come again cool flower?
Sure. So that just indicates that they branch, and if you harvest them and keep after them, harvesting and cutting them, they will continue to send up additional stems.
Yep. And just like in our part 1, I am going to ask the same questions for every single plant that we cover. So the first question is going to be, why is this plant worth growing? The next question will be, how many stems does each plant produce? And again, the number of stems per plant can vary based on a number of different factors: your experience level, your growing conditions, the variety, whether or not a plant was pinched. These things can all impact the number of stems you get per plant, and Lisa's estimate is just to give you an idea of what you might expect. We're going to find out, how long does this plant produce? And then we're going to find out if Lisa plants successions on the farm, and if she does, how many and how far apart.
All right.
Just keep in mind when we're talking that we're located in USDA Zone 7B8A in southeastern Virginia. If you live in a cooler region, you might be able to have cool flowers producing for a longer period of time than we talk about. You might be able to plant more successions than we talk about. And if you're in a much warmer region, you might have to plant fewer successions than we're talking about. And your cool flower season in general might be a little bit shorter.
So true.
All right, so we are on to the very first one. This is one of my favorites, Lambada. So this is actually an annual Monarda. It's in the bee balm family, and Lambada is winter hardy to USDA Zone 7. Lambada have these beautiful lavender flowers that are kind of stacked at the top of each stem. It's fragrant, bees love it. It's a fantastic filler for bouquets, and this is one that has a lot of value in a landscape setting because it looks beautiful before it even blooms, all the way to after the blooms have kind of faded. So Lisa, why is this plant worth growing?
For many of the reasons that you just listed it. It is got a wide range of when it can be harvested. I love figuring out the very earliest I can cut it where it will stay hydrated before it actually even blooms, right up through blooming. It is just, I will say, it causes quite a stir with commercial customers and in bouquets, as you indicated. Plus, it is a huge favorite of bumblebees. So we really love enjoying and including this in our cutting garden. And it looks really different than the standard perennial Monarda. And that's why people don't often recognize it. So it is definitely worth growing.
And that purple color, again, it's like a lilac lavender shade, and it pairs so beautifully with the green of the unopened flowers higher up on the stem. I just love it. So
Yes.
how many stems would you say each plant produces, and how long does it produce for you?
It can have a lot of stems, particularly if you pinch it. It responds really well to pinching. And if you cut it deep when you're harvesting, it will continue to send up not quite as substantial stems as the first ones, but certainly worthy. So it definitely sends up. I mean, gosh, it's really hard to say. I would say 10 plus stems per plant easily.
Yeah. And how long would you say it keeps producing for you?
It will go right into summer. And typically it stops because we stop cutting it. You know, other crops come on and we kind of stop cutting it. So I would say that it will go right into our summers here in Southeastern Virginia for sure.
Yeah.
Which also leads me to say that this could be a good, succession plant.
And that leads to the next question. So do you plant successions?
So we plant it in the fall because it's winter hardy here, and then we plant it in very early spring in an effort to extend that bloom. And I would say that I would definitely be willing to say that planting it yet again 4 weeks or so after that very early spring would be a worthy try for some additional cuts. Yeah,
Yes,
for sure.
I agree. This is just a great one. You should really try it if you haven't already. Next up, we have a flower that is very slow growing, especially if you start it from seed. And for that reason, a lot of farmers buy plugs instead. And I am talking about Lizianthus. You might also hear them referred to as Lizzies. Lizianthus are winter hardy to USDA zone 7. They come in so many different shades. There are pinks, purples, whites, greens. They could easily be mistaken for roses. That's kind of the form of the flower that they have. And they have an extremely long vase life. And this is another one that looks stunning, either in a mixed bouquet or just all by itself, have a bunch of them in a vase. So why is Lizianthus worth growing?
Lizianthus causes more of a stir with customers. Everyone does immediately think it's a rose, but it's not.
Yes.
It's even more delicate than a rose. But it definitely brings to the table that rose type of flower, which is like a feature flower, right? And Lizianthus, unlike all other most other cool flowers, likes a cool start for a hot finish, because these guys bloom in the middle of summer and they just look so delicate that it feels like they shouldn't even be blooming then. But they are a super long lasting, high demand, just absolutely beautiful flower. And people think they're fussy and they're not really. And we grow them outside in the field. And as long as you just follow a couple of ground rules and keep your eye on the sky for rain, you'll do a beautiful job with them. Because if you have a lot of open blooms, you don't want them to be rained on, is what I meant by that. And but it is a definitely must grow if you're a flower farmer. But you can actually even purchase plants online as a gardener on some gardening websites.
Yeah. So with Lizianthus, there are multiple flowers on each stem. How many of those flowers do you like to have open when you harvest?
So for the best value for our commercial customers, our goal is to have 3 or 4 blooms per stem open. And there will be several other blooms that are not open, that are in bud, which also add great interest, and they're really beautiful. And many of them will go on to open. But the more blooms you have open on a stem, the more value when you bunch them, or even make, we would often make just straight Lizianthus bunches for the farmers market and our members only market, because they're just so beautiful. But the more blooms that are open, the less stems you have to put, because they're just voluptuous. They're beautiful.
They're beautiful. And for me, the buds are actually one of my favorite parts. They just add a freshness and they just look so graceful in the bouquets. So I love the open flowers and the buds. Yeah. All right. So how many stems would you say each plant produces, and how long does it produce for you?
Sure. So, Lizianthus, in our experience, I didn't used to pinch. We do now pinch at least 50% of our crop. So instead of getting, when you don't pinch, one central stem, that's a honker, and then you'll get 2 or 3 very minor stems, perhaps. If you pinch when they're like under 8 inches or so and growing, we get 3 to 4 major stems off of each plant. Lizianthus will potentially flush again in the fall, but it's really a challenge to keep them healthy and happy until fall. Lizianthus is it's a needy plant in the fact that it doesn't bush out with vegetation. So weed pressure is really strong on that, which means it needs to be hand weeded every week. Even when you use film or landscape cloth, the weeds around the base of the plant, because of the time of year, think about August and September when the weeds are at their strongest. Most people, myself included, don't find it worthy enough for all the work that's required for that second flush. For our growing conditions, other people may not find that to be true, but you can get a second flush out of them.
So do you plant successions?
Well, not really. So we plant these in very early spring, although we can plant them in the fall. We don't find a really big benefit to doing that. And so we plant them in the spring, I'm sorry. And there are different groups of Lizianthus. You'll see a little number after the name if you're looking online. And that indicates that some of them will start to bloom as the days get longer, just meaning that you're only going to get a few days or maybe even a week variation in bloom time. So it's really difficult to succession plant it. You have to be very targeted to do that. So for us, no, we plant them once. I do plant from a couple of different groups. I usually plant the 3s and 4s, I think it is, which are the later blooming, which allows them to elongate and grow tall before they start blooming to get the maximum stem length.
So you do one planting time, but you select from different groups, and that kind of has the effect of staggering your bloom times just a little.
Not quite as wide as we would like, but it does change. It does stagger it a smidgen.
Okay, next up, we have a really interesting looking flower, and these are pincushion flowers or scabiosa. Sometimes people refer to them as scabies. Scabiosa atropurpurea and Scabiosa stellata are winter hardy to USDA zone 7, and the center of this flower looks like a ball, and then it has all these long stamens poking out of it. So it truly looks like a pincushion with needles or pins sticking out of it, hence the name. But they're so whimsical. The stems themselves are very wiry and delicate looking, and the flowers just really hold my interest whenever I see one. There are so many different colors available, from really light shades to really dark. There are also varieties like ping pong, or you might have heard of starflower. If you're watching over on YouTube, this is what I have in the center of the screen. It's Scabiosa stellata, and these are grown primarily for these really interesting round seed heads. So Lisa, why are Scabiosa worth growing?
I mean, gosh, the colors, you have the Fata Morgan and the white displayed here. There's also a Fire King red, and there's a Black Knight, the colors, and the blue cockadee. I mean, I grow all 5 of those colors. They're very, they're just so beautiful and intense at that time of year. We fall plant them and very early spring plant them to stagger. And the fall planted are so tall and wiry, as you mentioned. I mean, they'll get 60 inches tall. I mean, they are so beautiful in the garden. And I love cutting them from very early buds when they just start to change colors right up until they're open. But they give multiple stems per plant, and they're very unique and bring a special whimsical touch to bouquets. And commercial customers love them.
Yeah. And there are actually annual and perennial varieties of Scabiosa. You tend to grow annuals primarily.
True. So These are cool season hardy annuals. There are some very beautiful perennial types of scabiosis. However, here in our southern region, they are not typically long lived. I know in northern regions, people get many years from them, but we have grown those too as hardy annuals, but they are not nearly as productive as these guys are.
Yeah. If you are looking for a perennial scabiosa, the Fama series of Scabiosa caucasica is just beautiful, by the way. Okay, going back to the annual varieties, how many stems would you say each plant produces? And how
Sure.
long does it produce for you?
So I would be willing to say 5 to 8 good, nice stems per plant. And, again, it's many of the hardy annuals, because we grow so many and we cut them hard until the warm season tender annuals start, then we tend to kind of let them fall off. You know what I mean? We aren't as out there cutting them as hard as we were. So in my memory, it seems to me that when we start heading into summer, the scabiosis starts to kind of fall off. Is that because we stopped cutting it so hard, or is that because the plant stopped? So those are those kind of one of those things you have to kind of experiment for your own growing conditions, because what we find is we love having a new flower for a period of time, and then we're done with that one and we move to the next one. So, but I would say we get a good 3 to 4 weeks at least.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before, just embracing the seasonality of flowers and enjoying them while it's their prime time to shine. So do you plant successions?
So yes, you can fall if it's winter hardy for you to fall plant and then to very early spring plant again. And I tell you, as a general rule, any cool season hardy annual that grows really tall, like this particular one does, you can always experiment with even doing another succession 4 weeks after very early spring, depending on what your spring and early summer conditions are, because that's a big part of fall planting. You get this enormous stem, but when they're 48, 50, 60 inches tall, I mean, you could get away with half of that and they'd still be tall enough. So I think we do fall in very early spring. I think a 4-week later succession would be in order for anyone that wanted to extend that bloom time.
Yeah, and that's also a good note for home gardeners as well, because a lot of times the stem length is not as important to us because we're just enjoying them in the landscape. So you might be able to plant successions and get beautiful flowers out in your garden. They just might be a little shorter than their fall planted or earlier planted counterparts.
Yes.
All right. Up next, we are going to have 2 different species of poppies. We are going to start with giant poppy pods, and the botanical name for these is Papaver somniferum. These are winter hardy to USDA Zone 6, and like the common name implies, these are specifically grown for these large, super interesting looking pods that develop after the blooms have faded. So, why are giant poppy pods worth growing?
Well, they are, I mean, people see the flowers, which if you're not watching this on YouTube, I recommend for this one alone to go over and take a peek. And because the flowers are quite breathtaking, however, they only last for 24 to 36 hours, but it's the pod that is revealed. And it is definitely a very in-demand, fresh cut flower use. And frankly, for us, for our like casual bouquets, that was what we made for supermarkets and farmers markets. We like the pods soon after the petals fell off, because they're smaller. You don't want it, because you can see in the image how big that pod is with my hand next to it. Commercial florists that do a lot of really big arrangements would love that giant pod, but we like them a little bit smaller when they're beautiful green. They're unlike any other flower or texture in a bouquet.
Yeah, they just add a lot of interest to any arrangement that you put them in. Do you ever use these dried, or do you mostly just use them fresh?
So we use them primarily for fresh, but we have dried them for the, dried flowers are back in, right? So we started drying some just to test them, and they're just as beautiful with their dark tan type of color. They keep their shape, they shrivel up a little bit. So dried is also a really great option if you're doing wreaths or any of that type of stuff.
Yeah, I love the color they get when they're dried.
Yeah.
All right. So how many stems would you say each plant produces, and how long does it produce for you?
So this starts blooming for us typically in May, and I was surprised after I went through and harvested a bunch of stems that were plenty long. These get very tall. We fall plant them, so they can get 5 feet. When I would go through the garden and cut the stems plenty long enough, but not really cutting them at ground level, not even thinking about additional stems, I was pleasantly surprised to find branching stems a couple of weeks afterwards that did go on to make excellent cuts. So I would guess and say probably 2 or 3 really nice stems, but then they definitely send up side shoots.
Yeah. So how long would you say it's producing for?
Probably once the petals fall off, you can leave, if you're looking for really big ones or you're saving seed, you leave them out in the garden until they get dry. So you would not be harvesting right away, but I would say probably 3 to 4 weeks of getting nice, fresh used green pods.
All right. And do you plant successions?
No. We only fall plant a seed. It's a direct seeder, and that's the only time.
Now we're going to move on to another poppy, and this is Papaver nudicale, which are Iceland poppies. And these are actually grown for the flowers. These are winter hardy to USDA zone 6. And just in general, poppies have some of the tiniest seeds you will ever see, and they also produce some of the most delicate looking flowers you'll ever see as well. They're really large flowers. They have petals that look like they're made out of crepe paper. There are a rainbow of different colors available. There are pinks, oranges, yellows, reds, whites. They are not the most long-lasting flower, but they are beautiful. So why are Iceland poppies worth growing?
Kind of what you just described, the paper type, beautiful, just deep, rich colors are unlike any other flower. And I kind of compare these to sweet peas and say, they only last maybe 5 to 7 days, but it's the best 5 to 7 days with a flower you've ever had. So it is definitely worth growing. I mean, we have people that would just look forward to the poppy season just to have a little vase with whether it was 5 or 15 in a vase. They're just so very, very beautiful. And it's one of the very first flowers to bloom on our farm.
Yeah. And I do think that the ephemeral nature of these flowers tends to make you cherish them more.
It's true.
All right. So how many stems would you say each plant produces, and how long does it produce for you?
It can be very short-lived, and it definitely is related to the weather. So if we have a long, cool, moist spring, we could get 5 weeks out of, and if you just keep cutting them, you cut the stems literally all the way at ground level. And if you keep them harvested and they get moisture and it's cool enough, they will just keep pumping out the stems. But if it heats up and humidity starts, they get shorter and shorter and shorter, and they just kind of peter off. But I would say 5 to 8 stems per plant if they're happy.
Yeah. And Iceland poppies, as their name implies, they don't like the heat too much.
Yes, correct.
All right. So do you plant successions?
Nope. We just direct seed in the fall or plant plugs.
All right. Next up, we have a flower that has some of the most interesting seeds you will ever see that look like little seahorses. And I am talking about pot marigolds, also known as calendula. And calendula are winter hardy to USDA zone 7. They have large sort of daisy shaped flowers. The varieties that we tend to grow are pretty densely petaled. And there are orange colors, bronzes, yellows, ivories. Calendula are extremely early bloomers, and they're generally very fast to bloom. They typically have a relatively short number of days to maturity. So why are calendula worth growing?
I like to call these guys the zinnias of early spring. They're that same shape as a zinnia, as you mentioned, like a daisy. And it's their colors, particularly the bright orange and the bright yellow. Some of the spring blooming flowers tend to be pastels, blues,
Yes.
lavenders, pinks, and whites. This kind of pumps it up a little bit. And calendula is, as I mentioned, one of the earliest flowers to bloom on our farm. And we love it because the pollinators, the foliage is actually sticky because it excretes nectar, which really makes it a beneficial plant for your garden. But growing it for those early cuts when you're kind of desperate for flowers is really a great reward. So I love just bouquets of calendula. I mean, it's really very
Yes.
beautiful. And we cut them when they're tight. So you get the maximum vase light, and you cut them at ground level to keep the blooms coming.
So how many stems would you say each plant produces, and how long does it produce for you?
So how many stems? I don't pinch this guy because it has a different kind of growth habit. But if I cut that first central stem all the way down, literally at ground level, I would say that we get probably 5 to 7 nice stems. But if it stays cool and moist and you keep them cut, they will keep on blooming. They really are a long bloomer if you keep them harvested. And so until the heat and humidity arrives. So it could be 3 weeks, it could be 6 to 8 weeks.
All right. And do you plant successions?
We fall plant this one. We did lose some this year with the polar blast, and we've got a ton started to replant again. But that would be our succession, fall and then very early spring. And depending again, as you mentioned earlier, if you have a cool conditions in your summer, this would definitely be one I would do additional successions of.
Yes. All right. We are on to the last flower of today. And this is one of my favorites. And this is actually an ornamental carrot called Daucus, or it's also known as Queen Anne's lace or chocolate lace flower. Docus is winter hardy to USDA zone 7. Up on the screen, if you're watching over on YouTube, we have Dara, which is one of the most popular varieties. These are extremely productive plants with these lacy umbels of different sizes and colors. They're chocolatey purples and mauves, light pinks, and these colors can all be on a plant at the same time. The stems get really tall, and in our garden, every time I see these umbels out there, they literally look like they're floating above all the other plants, like they're magically suspended in the air. They're so pretty. These are also a pollinator and beneficial insect magnet, like many of the umbel-shaped flowers, and they look so beautiful in the garden, in a mixed bouquet, or just all by themselves. So, Lisa, why is Daucus worth growing?
Well, Queen Anne's lace is probably one of the most requested flowers back when I first started growing. People see it on the side of the road, right? It can be actually an invasive in some areas. We don't tend to see it so much here. And everybody loves it. It's a big flat flower. And then Dara, of course, brings all these extra colors. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the image on the right, how densely petaled this is. There's just a lot of flowers and a lot of different colors. And I just love that variation. I love the light pink and the white. It just really makes for a really nice mixed offering, and it's a big flat flower, and our commercial customers loved them as much as us. And I love them especially because they are particularly attractive to hoverflies who are aphid eaters. And so we kind of love them for that too.
Yes. All right. So how many stems would you say each plant produces, and how long does it produce for you?
I would say 10 to 20 nice stems if you cut it deep and hard. And if you keep it cut, what happens is there's so many stems, we tend to not cut them deep enough. And then that leads to producing short stems, which are basically not good for anything other than the hoverflies. So cutting them deep will keep them producing. But for us, it's about a 3 to 5 week window, depending on the weather conditions.
And this is another one that adds a lot in a landscape setting because the flowers look really interesting at all stages of development, even once they're producing seeds. and they will reseed if you let them. So which stage do you like to harvest at?
All of them. And because we tend to overplant this, I mean, I always plant more than, when you plant them, you think you need that many, but when they start blooming and you see how dense they are, you realize you've made a, grave mistake in your judgment. And so what happens then, it's easy to not cut them all. So I have found, I like to cut them when they're really, really young for those stems that are thick and strong. I mean, when they're like 2 inches across and haven't even broadened out into like an umbel-like look, we start cutting them then to extend the bloom season earlier. And then I cut them up until the time that they start producing, before they start producing seed. So through all the stages, and they're really particularly beautiful.
They are. Like Lisa said, in some places they can be considered invasive, so you may want to look into that depending on your area. So do you plant successions?
Other than fall planted and very early spring planting, which opens it up a couple of weeks, it delays them. I really feel like this is such a winter hardy plant here. We give it no cuddling. And it just comes right through these really deep dive temperatures. I feel like people in zone 6 really need to experiment with fall planting on this one. And I would fall plant, very early spring plant. And because it's so tall, why not try another planting? But the thing you want to remember about trying these later plantings is remember about being seasonality. You know what I mean? I say that, but sometimes I think we naturally crave the flowers of the season, and after they're done, you're ready to move on. So keep that in mind.
So true. Well, that was our episode for today. Hope you found that helpful. Make sure to come back next week because we will be finishing the last 7 cut and come again cool flowers. We always love when you leave reviews or ratings if you're listening in a podcast app, or likes and comments over on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Layne, thanks so much for putting that together. And friends, if you're enjoying it, as Layne mentioned, please give us a subscribe, and we'd love to see you again. So until we meet again, friends, bye, Layne.
Bye.
Ciao.